So as I've already said, now I would like to welcome officially our two distinguished keynote speakers that accepted the invitation by Jean Monnet module EUMIGRO to this conference, and I'm very happy to have them both because Professor Stefania Panebianco is PhD in International Relations, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Catania in Italy. She teaches Mediterranean politics, EU and global trade, migration in the Mediterranean, and at the same time she is the head of the Jean Monnet chair. The Jean Monnet family is pretty big. Namely EU-Mediterranean border crisis and European external action. And her main research interests include Mediterranean migration crisis, EU foreign policies, EU relations with the Middle East and North Africa. And our second great distinguished guest is Professor Rinus Pennings, just to provide you with some facts from his rich academic life. So Professor Rinus Pennings has been professor of ethnic studies at the University of Amsterdam since 1993. He founded the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies at this university in 1993 and then served as the institute's director until October 2005. From 1999 till March 2009, he has also acted as European co-chair of International Metropolis Family. In April 2004, he became coordinator of the European Commission-founded project, Network of Excellence EUMIGRO, and then he founded its independent follow-up, the EUMIGRO Research Network. For many years, Professor Rinus Pennings has written on international migration, settlement of migrants and related policies, migration and integration at the EU level, and local integration policies. Both speeches that you will hear in a while will be complementary as they will discuss the external and internal situation of the European Union in the area of migration and integration, as well as corresponding public policies. Each keynote speech will take about half an hour, and now I would like to invite our first keynote speaker, Professor Stefania Panebianco, to tell us about the EU and Mediterranean migration when politics unmakes policy. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You said 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a honor to address you this morning at the beginning of this third EUMIGRO Conference, which has been organized brilliantly, I would say, by Professor Marta Pachowska. I'm really very happy and that she has invited me to address you this morning. And I was also very happy to participate by offering the support of the Jean Monnet Chair I hold, the Jean Monnet Chair EUMIDEA. I think that the Jean Monnet modules chairs activities, research activities, which are run and funded by the European Commission, really make a good job, not just to focus on a specific topic. And I would say that migration and integration in the European Union is definitely today a very crucial issue of the essence itself of European integration. But it is also important because these networks, the Jean Monnet action, is functioning in order to create networks, groups, relations, friendships, and this is useful and important for the further generation, for the generation of students who will become scholars. I see young researchers in this room, and it is important that we gather together in order to raise questions. The issue of my topic of my presentation is actually to raise questions. I do not have firm and committed answers, but I really would like to launch and to suggest you food for thought. And for this reason, I am starting by showing you cartoon, which I think is meaningful in the sense of explaining what we are experiencing today. As you can imagine from the title that I have given to this slide, Tackling the Migrant Wave, the EU as a Crisis Manager in Distress, I am very critical towards what the European Union is doing today. Well, when I say today, as imagine since when the migration crisis has started, and definitely the migration waves have started already in the early 2010s, not just before, not just in 2015. It is a very conventional date, 2015, but it had started even before. And I see the European Union as an actor, not exactly a crisis manager, but an actor waiting for Godot, while the migrants arrive in high numbers. The European Union thinks about possible solutions. And then, considering that there is a new problem, well, it's not true actually, it's not a new problem, migration. When there is this new problem into the EU agenda, different hypotheses and strategies which might be adopted are considered relocation, or rather returns, or rather constructing walls in order to prevent the other migrants to enter the European Union, as if building borders in the middle of the Mediterranean was possible at all. Well, I was saying that I will try to launch some suggestions, some provocative ideas, and this is the list of the content of my talk. First of all, I would like to suggest that we are not exactly experiencing a migration crisis, because this is an age of migration. And figures I will show to you, probably many of you do know these figures, show that we are experiencing an age of migration. Secondly, we have to look at the causes of migration in order really to understand how migration can be tackled and managed effectively. And these are local and global causes. Thirdly, I would like to stress again that migration is an issue which really tackles the essence of the European Union. And many scholars of political science have identified the relation between migration crisis and EU crisis, the crisis of European integration. Fourthly, so many and different discourses and approaches have emerged within the EU institutions, within the EU institutional architecture, and these have not always been on the same line, but sometimes very opposite lines and discourses. And this has led, unfortunately, to the main point of this talk, which is politicization of migration. And politicization of migration, in my view, has not pushed towards effective policies to be adopted, but rather towards paralysis of adopting solutions in the migration field, in migration, EU migration policy. Then I will end by asking to you, well, I raised myself this question, Quo vadis Europa, where are we going to? And this is the key issue in order to address other issues such as the migration one. The figures. As I was saying, migration is considered to be a problem which was serious, extremely serious, in 2015. It's true, in 2015, the Mediterranean crisis was at its peak, in the sense that people were entering the European Union coming mainly and primarily via Greece. The Syrian war was at its peak, and Syrian refugees were escaping Syria and entering the European Union. When we consider the entire number of arrivals to Europe, it's obvious that we take into account different routes, because Mediterranean migration takes into account sea routes, and in particular Italy, Cyprus and Malta, but also land and sea routes, that is to say Greece and Spain. But I am not interested at all in the figures, because these figures, as you will see in the following slide, do change over time. Routes do change over time. Entry points change over time, as we have seen with the Mediterranean Central route. Once my government, the Italian government, had decided to adopt a sort of closing the ports and closing the border policy, the number of entries has dramatically dropped. This is not the issue. The issue is the number of people who die and lose their lives in the Mediterranean. I would say that this other side of the slide is extremely important, because this tells the humanitarian dimension of the crisis. And this shows that the Mediterranean route is one of the most lethal routes in the world. And the ratio is decreasing and worsening day after day, despite, I would say, some countries adopting this closure of the borders policy. This says that there is not a solution for migration in terms of closing the borders, because migration moves, the flows of migrants do move around the Mediterranean. What we are saying is that if from 2014 to 2017, constantly the central Mediterranean route was very important, basically Italy, and then the number of entries has stopped due to the Italian government decisions. We have seen that, I already mentioned the importance of the Eastern Mediterranean route in 2015. What has recently happened, and those of you who are very familiar with looking at the data published by the Mediterranean Migration Portal by UNHCR, you know that the new, in brackets, routes, the most important route nowadays is the Western Mediterranean route, which means people entering via Spain. What does it say? What is the meaning of this data? The meaning of this data is very simple. If we do not look at the causes, the multiple causes of migration, we cannot be effective in tackling and addressing the issue, because migration has several push factors. History has provided legal instruments to defend and to take care of those who escape from wars. Of course, I have in mind the Geneva Convention. There are protections if there are discriminations, sexual discriminations, religious discriminations. There is legal protection. The point is that probably the status of asylum seeker and refugee today is quite obsolete and out of date, because the point is, how do we protect those who are escaping from climate change, which is considered as being one of the new causes for migration? Or, for example, if we take into account the demographic pressures in some parts of the world. The picture I like very much, I like the most in this slide, is for sure the one which is in the middle. And this cartoon was very popular in Italy some time ago. It is representing one of the miners, unaccompanied miners, who lost his life recently in the Mediterranean, and he was cut, of course, due to a shipwreck, and he was found with his marks, marks in his pocket, because he had not his documents, but his document was his marks. And this is telling, and it is touching, and it really tells us that there is a cause of migration, which is structural poverty, which really should be taken into account when we talk about migration, which is, of course, a global issue, and it is a transboundary issue. Then if we want to address migration, it is important that we take into account that several actors have to come together and have to address the humanitarian disaster and the humanitarian dimension of migration flows. And there is a very popular instrument and framework which has been recently used by political scientists, which is following to the multi-level governance model. A sort of multi-level strategy is considered to be the only strategy which can be effective, putting together state actors, non-state actors, and those who are volunteers and who take care of people in distress in the Mediterranean or via land-sea routes. As I was saying before, it's obvious that the migration crisis is putting the EU in crisis. We have seen so many decisions, meetings of the European Council that have put seriously into discussion the instruments that had been indicated by the European Commission. Of course, what I have in mind is first of all the instrument of the quotas, which has very much debated and in the end it has been abandoned. There has been a EU crisis in terms of institutional cleavage, an institutional clash which has put institutions the one against the other. And this is, for sure, the result of different political stances, different political discourses, different rhetorics. Migration has relaunched concepts that seemed to be abandoned part of the past. What I have in mind, first of all, it is state sovereignty. In several EU member states, state sovereignty has come into the picture, replacing the supranational sovereignty, which was a concept typically identifying the European Union political system. Concepts such as state sovereignty, the need to defend our own interests, the willing to reconstruct the fortress Europe so that we can defend the European Union from the attacks of from the outside, are in fact concepts which have put into the shadow principle typical of the European Union, such as the solidarity principle. This is what has happened, and this is what is really still taking place following a process of politicization. The politicization of migration is the combination of different factors. Well, first of all, main factor, it's obvious that the capacities of EU member states to control EU borders and accommodate new migrants, when I say new, of course, I again abuse of the brackets, have been overstrained. It's obvious that EU member states, European Union, has demonstrated its weaknesses towards the capacity to deal with the issue, to at first identify people, but then it was put into practice. Identification is not a problem any longer, and to create practices in order to host people, host migrants entering the European Union. But this has been very stressful for EU member states who not all the time have found themselves on the same line in order to share the burden, in order to implement the solidarity principle. Our former Prime Minister Matteo Renzi used to say, who used to claim the principle of burden sharing, which was very much related to the quota system, which was then abandoned. Then this is the institutional dimension of politicization. But if we look at European public opinion, what we see considering European public opinion, well, the European public opinion perceives immigration into the EU more as a problem rather than an opportunity, or both. And this is clearly tested and verified by the European Barometer, which is one of the most famous tools to check public opinion towards several EU issues and migration as well. Migration has definitely become a salient issue, and it is perceived as the most important issue to the EU is currently facing, even more important than terrorism. And I am not, of course, going into the details of graphs of Eurobarometer, but please stay with me and look at the difference, the huge difference between migration and terrorism. Then this is meaningful. If respondents have to identify two different challenges the EU is facing, first of all, migration 40%, and only after half of the respondents feel and are committed and scared of terrorism. Of course, all the Eurobarometer data are available, then I leave these data for your own perusal. Politicization of migration, I was saying. People, European public opinion, really wants EU institutions or domestic institutions to take solutions, to act. They request to adopt a common policy of migration, or in any case, in any way, possible way, provide borders protection. The problem, though, is, I would say, normal. I have a graph which is not really that meaningful. That's normal. The institutions are there to solve problems, and we ask and expect institutions to solve problems. The problem, though, is that Europeans fear that there is a migrants invasion. And if they are asked by the Eurobarometer, they feel that there are so many migrants, but actually there is a misperception of legal migrants present in the European Union. They are perceived exactly as double in number, and I will show the data on that to you. What has been, I wouldn't say the result of all this, but probably also the result of all this, that this anger of the public opinion, of the electorates, has been combined with the rise of Eurosceptic right-wing populist parties. And this is a phenomenon which is happening all over Europe. I can talk about Italy, of course, and the rise of Lega, which is not any longer Lega Nord. It's a party which is present and very well embedded all over Italy, from north to south. And Lega is supported in the south as in the north. People, Italians, have forgotten that originally Umberto Bossi was talking about Roma ladrona, that he wanted to create secession, because now, instead of talking about Roma ladrona, there is Brussels, those bureaucrats in Brussels. Then nothing has changed considering the tones, considering the language, the violent language. It is the enemy that has changed. We have maintained the same, I would say, violence, but changing the term object of our anger. Well, many other this is a party which is running, it's a ruling party. That's why I'm spending a few words on Lega, apart from the fact that I'm Italian. And there are also other parties, such as the French Front National, UKIP in UK, or in Germany, Alternative for Deutschland. These kind of Eurosceptic right-wing parties are rising in Europe and changing the analysis of European integration, the debate on the European integration. What we have definitely lost is the so-called permissive consensus of the past century, when the elitist Europeanists invested in the European integration process, even though the public opinion was not that much interested or supportive. This I will skip for the sake of the time, but please let me spend a couple of minutes on this invasion of migrants. Well, actually, please come with me. This is a question of the special Eurobarometer 469 on integration of immigrants in the European Union 2018. And the question is, to your knowledge, what is the proportion of immigrants in the total population in your country? As you can see from the answers, very few EU member states, well, very few respondents have correctly located their own country. And on the one hand, we have Sweden, for example, Estonia, for example, Latvia. On the other side of this continuum, we have Central and Eastern countries that really believe Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, that in their country there are higher percentages of migrants. This is the light blue column, 8%, 10%, 11% are the answers, while the real percentage of immigrants, legal immigrants living in Slovakia rather than Poland is 0.6, 1.1, 1.3, 1.2. What is the meaning of this? We're not talking about figures. We don't care about percentages, but we do care about the feeling of public opinion, the feeling of the Europeans. And if the feeling of public opinion and Europeans confirm that we are scared, confirm that migration is a hot topic, if we put together rising of populist parties together with the rising of nationalism, the rising of these discourses on the defense of state sovereignty, this means that at institutional level within the European Union, EU member states act as veto powers. And this is what has happened if we take into account the reform of the Dublin regulation, which had been launched by the European Commission and then had been voted by the European Parliament, but then it was stopped and frozen for the time being by the European Council. Then what the EU member states are doing at the moment, they are acting as veto powers. The logic, the unique only consequences of acting as veto powers is to freeze a policy such as migration policy. And this is what is happening, that politics is making migration policy nowadays. I will leave you with the questions. I had promised you questions, and this is the food for thought I leave you with. I think that migration is an extremely important example of what we want to make of the European Union. Because the European Union has different possibilities and chances. Different paths are on the table. And then the key issue, the key question is, quo vadis Europa? We really think that we share ideas and interests still today? Do we think that we have common values that really push us to stay together and to elaborate common policies? And how is to be seen? It is the if that, in my view, is extremely important. And I am proposing, well, I am not proposing, I'm relaunching to you the different models. We might have a model which is the variable geometry model. It's not new, definitely. It's what has allowed the European Union to have a Eurozone, which is different than 28 EU member states, a Schengen area, again, different from 27 EU member states, or enhanced cooperation, which is definitely the issue. We can move together with smaller groups towards the objective. This is not a veto power system. It is completely different logic. What we have seen is the Brexit. We are still overwhelmed by the news. We do not know what is going on with Brexit since 2017, when there was a referendum. There are different negotiations and proposals and hypotheses. We still do not know. Are they voting in the May EP elections? Is this a solution we want? Is several exits what we want? Or there is still a reason, a common interest, a common value in order to remain with different variable geometries and paths, considering that remaining together is still a value, and we Europeans have the interest to let you solve problems, okay? This is what I leave for you, and thank you, thanks very much, merci, danke, grazie, Ditsky.
Dear Stefania, I would like to say many thanks, and I'm grateful I am for this introduction, this overview of what is going on in this external dimension of our EU reality, so Mediterranean, the issue of the crisis, but also what it may bring us inside the EU. And now, very smoothly, as I promised, from this external to more internal dimension, we would like to invite as our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Rinus Penning. So the floor is yours, and as Professor Stefania, you have half an hour to share your ideas and your conclusions with us.
Thank you very much, Marta. Yes, I'll talk about the internal affairs of the European Union. I took, let's say, the first words of the conference, challenges of migrant integration and challenges of migration and integration, and took it to the question of how do we organize this at the European level. Let me immediately try to make clear what I'm going to do. In a very quick overview, I'm going to illustrate two paradoxes in the European Union. The one is on migration. On the one hand, we want to have more mobility, and on the other hand, we want to have less migrants. There is a kind of strange thing in there. And the second is on integration. The question is, what integration do we have in mind, particularly for the internal mobile people? We don't have an integration policy at the EU level. We only have integration policies for third country nationals. So there are key kind of paradoxes in EU policies. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of how that is organized and what it means in terms of government, of migration and integration at the different levels within the European Union. The level of the EU, national level, in a number of cases, also the regional level in a country, and the local level of cities that have migrants and have policies. I'll do that by looking first at how it is organized for immigration policies in Europe and then for integration policies in Europe. And I come to a conclusion which then particularly looks at the local perspective. Now, the first thing. If we look back at the, let's say, post-Second World War period in Europe, then we see that Europe has become a continent of immigration. It was not after the Second World War. After the Second World War, it was a country of immigration. The period between 1945 and 1960, quite a number of Western European countries revived their immigration to the United States, to Canada, to New Zealand, to Latin America. We started from a perception of being an immigration continent, which was the case in the late 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century, but again, immediately after the Second World War. That changed in the course of time, particularly in northwestern Europe first. So we had this famous labor migration, guest worker migration period after the economic recovery of northwestern Europe after the war. There were more hands needed in this, let's say, industrial revolution that took place, or rebuilding. It was a Fordist production system in which you needed a lot of particularly unskilled workers in Europe in the period between 1960 and 1975. And millions of migrant workers came to northwestern Europe, particularly Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium, France, Switzerland. Switzerland was the first, by the way. So that's how Europe became a continent of immigration. It was followed in the 1980s by countries that were immigration countries before. So Italy, in the middle of the 1980s, Spain, but also Ireland, also Finland, countries that had been immigration countries before became immigration countries. And the last, of course, is in the period after the Central and Eastern European countries came into the European Union after 2004. Some of these Central and Eastern European countries also have started to become immigration countries. Particularly the Czech Republic, for example, is a good case, and Poland in the last years. Clearly, there is a significant inflow of particularly Ukrainian immigrants in Poland. So Europe has become an immigration continent. But at the same time, all of these immigrations have taken place into states that did not see itself as an immigration country. Germany refused to be an immigration country until 2004. And there has been a big battle in Germany whether we should accept that it was. The Netherlands, the same. All of these countries have called their immigrants with a kind of euphemistic terms that they were not immigrants. They called them guest workers, suggesting that they were temporary there. They called them repatriates, the migrants coming from the former colonies, like in the Netherlands. But they were not immigrants. So there was this paradox of states becoming actually immigration countries, but not wanting to be immigration countries, and not calling the ones that came immigrants. which of course had a consequence that we did not want to integrate them because that was not either not necessary or not wished for, because you had to return the guest workers, for example. So this is the paradox of Europe. They have become an immigrant continent, but they have not accepted in their policies and in their way of thinking that they were immigration countries. So the same happens for, let's say, the definition of what is a migrant. You know, this story of immigration goes together with the story of Europe becoming a European Union. And within that project of becoming a European Union, the free circulation of workers in the beginning and of people in general in the second phase was the main point of cooperation. You know, it started already with the treaty on coal and steel in 1951, with this phrase on workers in these sectors should interchange between the 6 countries involved at that time. The European Economic Community had the same kind of idea of the free movement of workers as an ideal, say, the European Economic Community being an ideal area in which there was free movement of workers. And that became, of course, the centerpiece of the European Union also, because it was actually taken over from the European community. You know, Schengen was 1985, no borders anymore, free mobility. And we didn't call them migrants anymore. They were mobile workers. So European Union phraseology changed from we don't have migrant workers internally, we have mobile workers. So migration got very specific notion. Inter-EU mobile persons are integrated by definition. They don't need an integration policy. So at the EU level, integration policy for immigrants is for third country nationals only. It's a little bit of a problem for the ones who are in Amsterdam, and the city of Amsterdam has a policy for the newcomers, and whether they come from the Ukraine or from Poland, it does not make a difference for the city of Amsterdam in terms of the facilities that they have to have for these immigrants. So there are these paradoxical kind of constraints within these policies. Now, to look more closely on the way this is handled, the governmental policies, we could look at them in terms of prototypes. And then look at how these policies came into existence at the European level. First of all, we heard already the term multi-level governance in the first lecture. It's coming back here, but at a third place. You can imagine that if you have policies on migration and immigration or integration, you might have a centralist type of policy, which is kind of top-down from the EU level to the national states to the local level. Hierarchical division of labor, control mechanisms, top-down, central policy frame and rules. And if we would have that, it would lead to a very strong convergence of policies everywhere. That's an ideal type of policy. The second one is exactly the opposite. If the city would be the one who had made decisions on migration and integration, it would be, let's say, the perspective bottom-up. The policy competences would be there. The city would take these decisions as far as possible, and all other levels would add to that, to those elements that the city could not do itself. But I would call that a localist perspective on policies. Now, the third one is what I call the multi-level governance type. It says, well, if you look at these policies, they're made, in fact, of the interaction and the coordination between the different levels, without the one of them being dominant, nor localist, nor centralist. And it would, let's say, be much more on consensus making in a way. By the way, if you talk about governance, you include not only the governmental levels from EU, national and local, but you also include the vertical levels of, say, the non-governmental organizations, stakeholders that do form these policies. And then there is a last ideal situation, or ideal typical situation, which, let's say, we see very often these days. That is decoupling relations. That means that cities, for example, do have policies that completely deviate from the national or the EU level. And they're from their own philosophy. There's an absence of meaningful policy coordination and often a contradiction. We see that, let's say, most prominently in cities' policy towards irregular migrants. Because, the national policies are based on we don't have them or we should not have them, so to be returned. But the city said, well, whatever you think, we have them. So we cannot we cannot let them die under the bridge. So we have to have a policy. So there are several of these, to say, moments of decoupling. Okay. Now, if with these ideal types of governance, we look at very quickly at immigration policies in Europe, then we see that, let's say, in the beginning, I told you already, there has been this development towards, let's say, less borders within first the European Economic Community, then the Economic Community, Schengen, EU, etc. It's quite clear that there has been built up, to say, through cooperation of national governments, a system in which there was created a new governance at the EU level that implicated the transfer of a number of competences to that EU level. It was necessary because entrance of anyone in any of the members of the European Community or the European Union meant that it could go to any of the other states. It meant that you had to have a common immigration policy, and that had to be decided. So the policy itself has come into existence by making consensus on it, but the policy, the control of itself, is of course top-down, and has to be top-down based on the consensus. So the Europeanization meant an increasing transfer of competency to Europe from the national authorities. So common immigration policies in the EU, by definition, means a hierarchical top-down structure to a certain extent. The way it comes into existence is exactly the opposite on consensus. Integration policies is a different story. First of all, we did not have integration policies until 2003-04. So the first big document on integration policies at the EU level was 2003. And from then on, the discussion before was always on immigration and the status of immigrants. In Europe, at the national level, as I said earlier, countries did not recognize that there were immigration countries. So most of them did also not have integration policies because they did not want to have immigrants. So the only exceptions there were Sweden and the Netherlands. Sweden was very early, already in 1975, starting, let's say, from acceptance of the fact that there were a number of immigrants and you should avoid them to become an underclass in society. That was the idea of Swedish and Dutch integration policies in the 70s and the 1980s. But it was exceptional in Europe. In the late 1990s and around the turn of the century, there was this idea in Europe that, well, we did not want to be immigration countries, but we did not avoid it either. So we have to do something for these immigrants. And particularly there we see the development of, let's say, mandatory self-financed integration courses for these newcomers. And actually you can say these were for two big reasons. One of them was protection of the national identity against these immigrants, but also secondly, to make it more difficult for the immigrants to come in. It was a way of having restrictive immigration policies. The most clear example were the Dutch, who introduced even, let's say, the integration courses in the country of origin before they got a permission to come to the Netherlands. It's clearly a selective instrument for immigration. So these are very specific kind of integration policies that have developed in particularly Northwest European countries. Because in the second generation immigration country in the South, this whole integration issue has been played out quite differently. What we have seen there is that particularly cities and regions in the 1990s started to make policies for immigrants and have, let's say, have pushed national governments to come up in the 2000s with some kind of integration policies. So we see quite different patterns of integration governance in Europe. And cities, you know, if you for a moment take the perspective of citizens, they depended very much on, let's say, in what national context they were, in how far they were able to do so. For example, in the Netherlands and in Sweden, they had the advantage of having early national integration policies, and they got a lot of money to do the local part of these national integration policies, which did not mean that other cities in Europe did not have integration. Berlin had a very early integration policy, but also Stuttgart and a number of other countries in which the national government did not have an integration policy at all. So the decoupling was a fact in many of these countries in the early phase. Okay, we go to the next. Now, if we see these paradoxes of policies on the one hand, if we see these different perspectives on these policies, on the different levels within Europe, so what can we conclude then? And what can we expect for the next, let's say, decades to develop? I would say that in immigration policies, we will have this kind of stalemate that you actually outlined in the first lecture. There will not be much of a chance for developing a real, what I call multi-level governance, a multi-level governance in which there is consensus and cooperation between the different levels and between, let's say, non-governmental organizations. So on the front of immigration, I'm really worried about what's going to happen there. And it has a history which does not make us very, let's say, comfortable with this idea. On the immigration front, I'm a little bit more optimistic. On the one hand, because there is much less of this top-down division of tasks and competences, which is regulated by law. So EU integration policies is a consensus policies of the national the member states that work together. The tools are based on consensus. The participation is based on consensus. And That gives much more influence to non-governmental organizations on these kind of things. It gives more leeway for local, for cities, the city of Warsaw, for example, who clearly has taken a stance in integration policies in the last years, as far as I understand. While the national government is not very comfortable at this moment. So here we see possibilities of developing, in some cases, multi-level governance of integration, but you still have to conquer these paradoxes that are included, which I outlined in the beginning. The EU level that defines integration as a matter of third country nationals only, and then leaves the city with no means and ideas for integrating intra-EU migrants, which is really a problem in a number of countries. So there should be solution, but there is more of a possibility to work that out in the course of time because of the different divisions of task. I hope I give you a little bit of an idea of how this works internally within the EU. Thank you very much for listening.
Dear Professor Rinus, let me thank you for this great opening speech. So during the second opening speech, keynote speech, we've heard about this historical context of European and EU, both migration and mobility after the Second World War till today. So it was very comprehensive in terms of what was said before by Stefania about this today's situation in Europe. Also, you've mentioned, and it should be stressed, these two different policies, if any policies, I mean immigration policies at EU level and at member states level, followed up by integration activities called also policies. So it was in fact a very comprehensive picture of Europe, migration, landscape of integration policies that we have. And I believe that it leaves us with an open question, the one, in fact, that is very tricky for myself, who is and who is not integrated and who should be integrated in the EU member states. And here we are back to this issue of EU mobility or intra-EU migration, as we say, and the question if only we should consider third country nationals, so the nationals from outside the EU, as these migrants that are supposed to be integrated by member states. So once again, Stefania, Rinus, let me thank you for these two great opening speeches. I hope that they were inspiring for our audience.